Crucible of the Vampire. Written by Amanda Murray. Narrated by Gemma Lawrence. Chapter 10. The Dark Lady Returns. The dawn was just breaking as Robert pulled up to the hall in his mud-splattered old Land Rover. He'd come over early that morning, as he'd planned on working a half day and had a lot to do. It was that time of year when everything was beginning to grow, and he always had a job keeping up with all the tasks that suddenly needed doing. He liked the early mornings for the quiet solitude it afforded him. He began gathering his tools together, slinging his fork, spade and whatever else he thought he'd need into the wheelbarrow, and began trudging along the gravel pathway towards the far end of the garden. The air was still chilly, and Robert zipped up his jacket. Arriving at a rickety gate, he pushed it open and entered an orchard. If he managed to prune the old apple trees, as well as making a good start on weeding the vegetable patch, he hoped he'd be able to get off work early enough so he could sneak in a late lunchtime pint at the Black Horse before going home. Robert had worked steadily for almost an hour, and the sky was beginning to glow with the first signs of dawn. He was making good progress, but it was thirsty work, and Robert had forgotten to bring his flask with him. Putting down his secateurs near a large clump of cut branches, he made his way back to the kitchen to grab a mug of strong tea. He was heading back along the pathway when he heard a crash coming from inside the house. He hesitated before he stopped to listen. Nothing. He was about to carry on when he heard it again. He looked up towards one of the windows at the top of the house where the noise seemed to be coming from, a puzzled frown on his face. Robert normally wouldn't have taken any notice of things like that. After all, Carl Scott Morton wasn't exactly someone who appreciated any interference. Plus, it was still quite early in the morning for the household to be stirring. But the conversation he'd had with Isabelle in the kitchen yesterday was still playing on his mind. He was worried about her. She'd seemed genuinely upset. He continued to walk towards the kitchen, which lay at the back of the house, his jacket slung over his shoulders, looking thoughtful and somewhat preoccupied. He could always get a pint at the Black Horse another time. Perhaps he should make sure she was all right. Isabelle found herself in an old-fashioned bathroom. It looked like it hadn't been used for years, and certainly it didn't appear to be operational, if the old toilet was anything to go by. There was a lock on the door, and Isabelle swiftly turned the old key, giving her a momentary feeling of security. She glanced out of the small window towards the woods in the distance. The glass on the window was cracked in a couple of places, and the hinges were rusty and old. It was covered in dust, and dead flies lay on the dirty and paint-peeling windowsill. They had long ago given up trying to reach the distant blue skyline that shimmered just behind the glass. Isabelle stepped away slowly from the bathroom door, listening intently for any sign of Scarlet, and suddenly became aware of someone breathing. She looked around the room, terrified, and then noticed a heap of grey blankets scattered in the dirty bath. She moved closer. The breathing was definitely coming from under there, only it was more like a rasping noise. She cautiously reached out her hand towards the pile of blankets and began to carefully lift the corner of one of them to see what was underneath. Hunched, as if in a state of hibernation, lay the ghostly girl that Isabelle had seen last night, her face white and unnatural. She stirred, but remained in a deep sleep. As Isabelle pulled back her covering, she let out a low growl. Isabelle hastily replaced the blanket over the dark lady, her hands shaking and trembling. She was fearful of disturbing her and edged away. As she did so, she heard a thudding noise on the bathroom door. Scarlet had caught up with her. The body in the bath began to stir as the banging continued. Isabelle desperately looked around the bathroom for a way out and spied a small door. She ran towards it and opened it, praying that it wouldn't lead her into a cupboard. Fortunately, it exited into another small and equally squalid room, piled high with brown boxes and bits of old junk. As Isabelle turned to run, she saw the blankets shift and suddenly rise. The ghostly girl was waking up. There was an ominous moan. Isabelle gave a horrified gasp and ran through the door, slamming it firmly behind her. Scarlett's fists were banging hard on the bathroom door, and her angry cries could be heard echoing down the corridor. Smashing through the door's wood panel, Scarlett's white hand reached in and unlocked the door. She burst into the bathroom. Realizing quickly that Isabelle had escaped once again, she ran, oblivious to the growling girl in the bath, exiting through the same door as Isabelle had disappeared through only moments earlier. Robert came into the kitchen and plonked his jacket on the work surface next to a couple of glasses and a jug of yellowy-looking liquid. He paused and glanced around the kitchen. He noticed several of the drawers over by the door were open, and he could smell something strange. Something that was perhaps smoke? Had Evelyn been burning the dinner again? He sniffed the air and looked puzzled. He was about to take the tray over to the sink when he heard another noise from upstairs. He placed it back on the work surface and began to walk along the corridor towards the main part of the house. Robert was familiar with the layout of the hall, as he'd done the occasional repair job for Carl over the 7 or so years he'd been working for the family. But he had never been any further than the first floor. Even then, he'd only gone into a couple of the main bedrooms. The place was a vast labyrinth of unused rooms. The noise seemed to have come from the top of the house. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he noticed the burnt smell grew stronger. He saw a piece of clothing discarded on the floor by the cellar steps. But before he had time to investigate further, he heard a cry. Robert quickened his pace up the stairs. The feeling of unease was growing. The rest of the house was strangely quiet. Where were Carl and Evelyn? He carried on to the top of the house, breathless from his climb, towards the attic rooms he'd never before visited. He opened a small door and found himself in a long corridor with uneven floorboards. He moved stealthily until he came towards a room at the end of the corridor. Suddenly, hearing a noise behind him, he ducked inside the room. Hidden from view, Isabelle flew past, and he knew now beyond any doubt that she was in trouble. He could hear someone pursuing her, and without a second's thought, he stepped out of the room and straight into Scarlett. Scarlett crashed into Robert. Caught off her guard, she was sent flying across the floor. "Run, Isabelle! Get away!" Robert shouted after her. Isabelle turned around, surprised, and faltered for a few moments as she locked eyes with Robert, before heading off down the corridor. Thank God Robert had turned up to help her. Scarlett jumped off the floor and turned to face Robert, her eyes glaring and her face angry. Scarlett was tall and athletic, but Robert stood over 6'3". Yet Scarlett still managed to push Robert effortlessly out of the way, with her fists hard against his chest. She heard him yelp in pain. She turned away and chased after her prey. Robert fell backwards onto the uneven wooden floor, crashing into a nearby chair. The fall knocked the wind out of him, and he heard an unpleasant crack. He groaned as a sharp, searing pain shot through his body as he tried to sit up and move his leg. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew Isabelle's life was in danger, and he had to help her somehow. Mustering all his strength, he struggled to his feet and limped painfully out into the corridor after both Scarlett and Isabelle. Isabelle ran into one of the attic bedrooms. There was a lock on the door, but she knew it wouldn't keep Scarlett out for long. She desperately looked around and found a chair which she wedged against the door handle as well. She leaned against the door, exhausted. The room was painted in a sickly pastel pink and was sparsely furnished with a couple of single beds covered in old-fashioned candlewick bedspreads. Surely no one ever slept in these squalid rooms, she thought. She jumped when she heard a pounding on the door. Scarlett threw herself against it, trying to force the door open, and Isabelle pushed hard on the other side, trying to prevent her entry. There was only the door between them, and Isabelle could feel Scarlett's anger and rage pulsing through the wood like an electric current that passed through her body. The furious banging stopped, and Isabelle could hear her quietened breathing. Scarlett whispered through the door in a soft, persuasive tone. "It's all right, Isabelle. Open the door. It's okay what you did. I understand. We can do what we want now. We can be together." Isabelle blinked back a few tears and crept quietly over to the window. Perhaps there was a way out through the small window. Outside was a balcony, but what then? They were at the top of the house, and the only way would be over the roof. She tried the windows. Locked. Damn this house, didn't anything open? She rattled the window to see if she could loosen the frame or dislodge the lock. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the window was sealed permanently shut. Scarlett continued speaking to Isabelle through the door. Her voice was tinged in sadness. "It feels good to be like this. You'll like it. Come on, Isabelle. Open the door." Isabelle paced around the room, looking in desperation for a way out. "I just want to taste you again. Just a little bite. Please. It won't hurt. I promise." Isabelle was breathing hard. Her chances of escape were looking pretty slim, until she looked around the edge of the room, and tucked under the eaves, she noticed a tiny hatch in the corner in the shadows. It must have been an original fire escape. She rushed over to it and knelt down on the floor and pushed hard. It was jammed, but Isabelle was determined. She kicked it with her foot, and she heard the wood splinter. She continued pushing it until it slowly gave way, stiff and creaking with age. One final hard push, and it opened just wide enough for her to crawl through. Getting no response from Isabelle, Scarlett grew restless and furious again and began to hammer the door with her fists. "Open the door, you bitch! You murdered my father!" She stepped away from the door and ran at it with all her might, smashing it open. Scarlett burst into the room. She looked around. Isabelle was gone. Then her eyes lighted on the small open hatch. Robert limped out into the corridor in search of Isabelle. He realized that something was broken in his leg. He could feel the excruciating pain and the swelling, but he tried to ignore it. He knew that he had to help Isabelle, that her life was in danger. He shuffled along the corridor, leaning against the wall for extra support. A strange, snarling, rasping noise stopped him in his tracks. It was like noise he'd never heard before. Angry, venomous, wretched. He turned around to see what it was, and as he did so, something small with marble-like limbs and cavernous eyes flung herself at him, her long hair flying as she entwined her thin arms around his body. "What the fuck?" he cried out in shock as she lurched at him. They fell to the ground. He lay stunned, looking into her white, ghostly face, the pain in his leg momentarily forgotten. She snarled, and as she did so, Robert saw her vampire fangs. His eyes were wide with fear as she moved her head towards his throat. She tore away at his warm flesh. Blood spurted out and hit the wall, where it dripped down slowly. The ghostly woman was covered in blood. It dripped out of her mouth, and her eyes were like black coals gleaming with evil. Robert felt the life in him begin to slip away. Again and again she plunged her fangs into his neck and sucked on his blood, until he lay still and silent. Only his eyes were left gazing in surprise and fear. Isabelle hurtled down the staircase. If only she could get the hell out of here. All she had to do was outrun and outwit Scarlet, and freedom would be hers. She reached the first floor and slipped through a door and began to run along the main corridor. Perhaps she could make her escape via the back staircase near the kitchen. She knew there were other exits she could try. There must be a way out of here. She could hear Scarlet behind her, so she ran into a room she'd not been in before. The impressive carved oak door opened easily, and she found herself in a large, high-ceilinged room. She quickly ascertained that this was one of the unrenovated rooms, a washroom that must have been used by pupils when it had been run as a boarding school. It had a long central island, with an old-fashioned formica top with wash basins either side, about 20 in all. There were still the old freestanding wooden racks where the boarders' towels would have been hung. Out of the grimy and dirty window, she could see the woods in the distance, silhouetted in the early dawn. A large crack in one of the glass panes let in a cold draught. There were a couple of closed-off cubicles. She looked inside one of them. It had an old bath inside, grubby and dusty and full of dead flies. She shut the door and crouched in the corner, shaking, desperately trying to muffle her rapid breathing. The handle turned slowly, and Scarlet walked inside, brandishing the blood-stained knife, a look of determination on her face. The dawn was approaching, and the sun was low in the sky, its pale rays diffused through the dirty glass windows and lighting up half of the room with its pale, shadowy light. Her footsteps were muffled on the cracked linoleum floor, her shadow cast against the wall like a ghost. Glancing around the room, she searched for Isabelle. She knew she was in there. She smiled to herself as she stood outside one of the cubicles. Bracing herself, she kicked it open with her foot. It was empty. At the second cubicle, she lunged at the closed door, and it gave way immediately. She was met by Isabelle, who came hurtling out screaming, smashing into her and pushing her violently backwards, towards the rows of wash basins. Scarlet could feel the hard edge of the wooden surface digging into her back. Isabelle grabbed Scarlet's neck with one hand and strained her head backwards until her long blonde hair was in the wash basin. With her other hand, she grabbed Scarlet's wrist and tried to hold her hand away. Scarlet was waving the sharp-bladed knife dangerously near Isabelle's face. But Scarlet was too strong, and she managed to break free of Isabelle's hold. Her eyes glowed red as she twisted her head down and sank her teeth deep into Isabelle's arm. Isabelle screamed and let go of Scarlet. She looked down at her arm. It was red and bruised. Blood was seeping through 2 small but deep cuts in her skin. Before she had time to think, Scarlet recovered her advantage, grabbed her arms and violently threw her against the wall. Isabelle felt her body recoil as she struggled for breath. She had no time to feel the pain as Scarlet came at her with the knife. It glinted in the emerging rays of sunshine as it came flying straight at her chest. She quickly ducked out of the way, and it hit the wall behind her. Isabelle heard the blade scrape against the plaster and a chunk of masonry fall to the floor, the dust going over both of them. Scarlet screamed and took a ferocious swing with the knife, aiming for her throat. Isabelle threw herself out of the way, but only just, the razor-sharp blade slicing off a piece of her hair that fell like a feather to the ground. The momentum of the swing had thrown Scarlet momentarily off balance. Isabelle saw her chance and ran to the door, desperately trying to turn the key in the lock. but her hands fumbled, and before she knew it, Scarlet had grabbed her by the hair and pushed her against the wall, holding her in place. As she lifted the knife for one last stab, Isabelle kicked out with her foot into Scarlet's stomach. Scarlet yelped with pain and surprise. The knife went flying out of her hand and landed on the other side of the room. Scarlet doubled up, clutching her side. Isabelle made the most of her momentary advantage. This time she managed to unlock the door. She exited the washroom and ran as fast as she could along the long corridor. Scarlet, her eyes blood red, left the knife and chased her. She was only inches behind her now. Isabelle could hear her snarling breath, and as they reached the long gallery, Scarlet stretched out her hand and managed to grab hold of Isabelle. Isabelle slipped and knocked against the wood panelling on the wall. Scarlet lunged at her and wrapped her arms around her waist, managing to slow her down. Together they twisted and struggled for several moments, Isabelle trying to shake Scarlet off, and all the while trying to avoid letting her sink her teeth into her. Isabelle felt her strength sapping, but with one last burst of adrenaline, she screamed and gave a forceful push, and at last managed to throw Scarlet off. She fell to the floor, free from Scarlet's clutches. Scarlet was knocked sideways towards the balcony rail. In one awful moment, Scarlet's fate was sealed. Losing her balance, she hit the top of the old oak banister with some force and toppled over the rail. Scarlet let out a horrible scream as she fell the 30 feet to the hall floor below. It seemed to last forever. Isabelle would never be able to erase that scream from her memory. She felt sick as she heard the bone-crunching sound of Scarlet as she hit the floor below. Crouching on the floor in the harrowing silence, Isabelle became almost paralysed with terror. Eventually, in what seemed to be forever, she got to her feet and moved towards the banisters, almost afraid of what she would see below. She peered down into the hall and saw the twisted and contorted body of Scarlet lying on the faded Chinese rug near the organ, her arms outstretched like a cross. A dark pool of blood was gradually seeping from her head. The key on the chain was strewn a few inches away from her outstretched hand. Isabelle gasped. Scarlet's eyes flickered, and she looked up at Isabelle. She was still alive. She paused for a few moments while she looked at Scarlet. The desperation of the situation suddenly got to her, and she choked back a few tears. She sat back down on the floor, leaning against the banisters. Covering her face with her hands, she let the tears flow. The shock was overwhelming, and she could hardly bear to see Scarlet, see what she had done. But the key was all she needed to escape from this living nightmare. She wiped her eyes and quickly ran down the stairs, ignoring the mounted animal heads on the walls, their glassy eyes seeing everything. She ran towards where Scarlet lay. As she stood over her, Scarlet looked up at her. The anger seemed to have gone, and instead there was a look of sadness and longing in her eyes. Isabelle knelt down near Scarlet, being careful not to get too close. She hesitantly scooped up the key in her hand and held it to her chest. But she couldn't move. There was something imploring in Scarlet's look. "Don't," she heard Scarlet say softly, breaking the dreadful silence, and Isabelle saw a tear run slowly down her white cheek. Isabelle felt some emotion rise inside her, something peculiar that made her want to reach out to Scarlet and touch her. Even in her vulnerable state, Scarlet seemed to have some kind of power over her. Scarlet's eyes widened, and she looked around as if sensing something. Their connection was broken, and Isabelle stood up and gave Scarlet one last pitiful look, before she began to edge towards the door. She hadn't got very far when she heard running footsteps from upstairs, followed by a spine-tingling scream. Isabelle gazed around, confused. She looked up at the landing but couldn't see anything. She wasn't going to hang about to find out who it was, and moved purposefully towards the front door, the key in her trembling hand. The screaming and footsteps grew louder, getting nearer and nearer. Isabelle panicked as she fumbled with the key in the door. It dropped out of her hands and she swore as she reached down and once again tried it in the lock. It wouldn't turn. She tried again, wiggling the key. The footsteps and screams were getting very near. As she turned around, she saw with horror the dark lady of the house running at her from the hall, arms flailing, her hair wild. Isabelle almost froze as she saw her grisly face smeared with blood and dripping from her mouth. She recoiled. All the horror of the last few hours welled up inside her again. She could hear her own heart pounding in her chest, like it too was trying to break free. She tried the key again, and this time she heard the click in the lock. Thank God, she thought as she swung the door open and hurled herself outside. Her feet crunched on the gravel, and she ran towards the rusty swing under the old oak tree, pursued by the creature, her fangs bared and her eyes ablaze. Escape was in sight. All she had to do was outrun this creature. Isabelle heard a thud. She had almost reached the tree when she turned around to see that the spectral woman had fallen to her knees. Her arms were outstretched towards Isabelle, still trying to reach her. Her deathly white skin had begun to smoulder, and drifts of smoke were coming off her body. Her cavernous black eyes stared at Isabelle, who stood paralysed with fear. The sun's rays were powerful as the night gave way to the dawn. As the sun hit her body, it began to burn. The flames engulfed her as she fell on the ground, crawling towards Isabelle, her horrible and angry screams piercing the air like shards of glass. Isabelle stood transfixed, unable to move as she watched her burn and melt. Her mind and body were worn out with the traumas she'd endured, and she had this overwhelming feeling that this was never going to end. The dark lady pounded her fists on the ground in anger, her torment fueling the fire. Isabelle stood back and watched, horrified, as she slowly turned to ash, and her cries grew weaker and weaker until they were finally no more. All that was left of the dark lady was fragments of ash and cinders that glowed on the ground, then floated away on the breeze. It was almost morning, and the sun was making its slow ascent in the east. The April air was still and quiet. The house loomed large, like a black, ominous shadow, and silent as death. Isabelle felt numb. Exhaustion seeped through her body, and she was unable to move from where she stood under the old oak tree. At last, she was free. She'd made it. All she had to do was walk away in the opposite direction. Leave this place and all the horrific memories behind. She should be feeling euphoric, but she felt empty. She had managed to overcome everything and everyone and escape from all of this. She looked around at the remnants of ash and smoke and thought of Scarlett lying inside, alone. What was stopping her from leaving? She did not understand a feeling of deep longing that was twisting up inside her. She looked at the pathway leading away from the house towards the road, and then turned back to the hall. From behind a darkening cloud, the sun's rays burst through, momentarily bathing the ground in golden light. Isabelle held up her hand to shield her eyes from the powerful shafts of light. It was almost painful. As she blinked, the glare of the sun caused her vision to blur and redden. Suddenly from inside the house came the sound of a thin, piping melody. She'd heard it before. It was the music from Jeremiah Cain's old journal. The melancholy tune was transported on the wind like a whisper, calling to Isabelle. The powerful notes infused her brain like symbols she struggled to decipher. She turned towards the hall. It stood before her like a large grey cloud that had suddenly blocked out the sun. Isabelle began to edge slowly towards the house, the music compelling her forwards. Her shoes crunched on the gravel, and the crows announced her presence, with the beating of their wings and their harsh caws. She hesitated when she reached the front door and peered through the glass. Without looking backwards, Isabelle carefully turned the handle and stepped inside. Scarlett's lifeless and twisted body lay cold and silent on the floor. A pool of blood had turned her blonde hair red. At the sound of Isabelle's footsteps in the hall, her still eyes flickered open, and a small smile played on her red lips. The end. Crucible of the Vampire was written by Amanda Murray and narrated by Gemma Lawrence. It was adapted from the screenplay for Crucible of the Vampire, written by Ian Ross McNamee, John Walskull, and Darren Lake. This has been a Ghost Dog Films audio production.